Greetings, friends of liberty. If we make a short hop, skip, and jump westward from Land's End in Cornwall, across the Atlantic, and as we descend, land in Portland, in northern New England, amongst our erstwhile colonials, we find that whilst you Americans imagine yourselves in many things such originals, are not original in the matter of your newly adopted Constitution, this being largely taken directly from ours. Now, given that our Constitution is not codified, as yours is, meaning that we have many separate constitutional documents, and not one, let us examine these separate and individual documents for instances of intellectual property theft. First, and likely foremost, the Magna Carta. This document, a contract between King John and his barons in 1215. It ensured the sovereignty of Parliament over the king, manned against his alleged divine right of rule. Wouldn't we all wish we were granted a divine right of rule by the Almighty himself, at least in marriage? Secondly, it ensures the guarantee of fair trials, now understood as a trial by jury, incorporated into your Sixth Amendment. And thirdly, a general protection of liberty and property, subject to the due process of the law found in your Fifth Amendment. In summary, the spirit of respect for liberty and natural rights, which infuses the Magna Carta, was transported wholesale into your Constitution. You're welcome. Secondly, the 1689 Bill of Rights. This document, inspired largely by the philosopher John Locke, guarantees free and fair elections, again reaffirms parliamentary sovereignty over the king, prohibits cruel and unusual punishments, which was incorporated into your own Eighth Amendment, and more or less reaffirms the principle of no taxation without representation. Now, if we turn from the similarities found in the British and American constitutions, with their respective for property and love of liberty, to 21st century America and the world today, we find the book Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World by British statesman and classical liberal political philosopher Daniel Hannan, who strives here mightily to describe exactly how it came to be that the Anglosphere, composed of course of England, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and perhaps on a very good day India, became the leading light bearer of civilization in the modern world. Why did the Anglosphere outstrip all other regions and all other forms of government? How was it able to rescue the world from the fascism of Nazi Germany and the communism of Soviet Russia, with millions of Indians, Australians, South Africans, New Zealanders, and Canadians joining British forces during World War II? And even today, they coming together yet again, along with Japan, to oppose Xi Jinping's brand of fascistic state monopoly, crony capitalism? In a word, because of England's love and protection of private property. It's really that simple. Hannan's focus here is deadly accurate, partly since property is really only for the most part the physical manifestation of and basis for knowledge, either in the matter of our bodies and brains or in our extended property. What, for example, is an automobile or an airplane, other than knowledge incorporated and embedded into matter? Which means that the less any society protects property, the less it encourages both the production and utilization of knowledge. In this regard, as Hannan quickly points out, the Anglosphere and its history outshines other regions and countries and their colonies, such as the relatively unsuccessful Hispanosphere, spawned by Spain and Portugal, and relative mediocre since the 18th century, France and its colonies. Think of the corrupt and poor Louisiana in the U.S., 48th out of 50 states in income, Haiti in the Caribbean, Algeria and Vietnam and Syria, and French West and Equatorial Africa. And think Italy, the poor thing only having had Eritrea, Libya, Ethiopia, and Somalia as colonies. Now, since Hannan himself was born and partly brought up in Peru, he has an extensive acquaintanceship with South and Central America, and so tells us that by 1900, 75% of Americans in rural areas owned land, but only 25% in Argentina and 3% in Mexico did. In addition, with regard to types of government, we find Peru suffering under the dictatorship of General Juan Velasco, having nationalized its economy in 1968, turning into a state of squalor from which it has only recently recovered. And we find Chile from the 1930s on, and under Allende in the 1970s, failing to protect political and economic rights. Numerous other cases, of course, in Latin America range from the Central American banana republics to Castro's dictatorship, where he and his thugs destroyed a relatively vibrant and increasingly prosperous Cuba. And, last but not least, the disaster of contemporary Venezuela. As Hannan concludes, no one has been especially surprised. In South America, property was insecure, the rule of law fragile, and civil government contingent. Similarly, if we look to the continent, how consistently is the modern European Union really an example of the rule of law, with Brussels and its unelected bureaucrats often creating them out of thin air, with its unlawful bailouts of or aid to entire countries like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, with the Lisbon Treaty, also known as the European Constitution, failing to be ratified by many national electorates and referendums in France, Holland, and Ireland. Clearly, the Anglosphere and its form of civilization have, at least up until the 21st century, triumphed. As a result of its civilizational superiority, English is the preeminent language of world communications and institutions. The suit coat and dress tie, quintessentially English, are standard business attire, and common law jurisdictions throughout the world offer a superior resolution of lawsuits and legal disputes. After an initial international comparison, Hannan's second and main focus is to describe the pivotal events of English history. Let's select some of these highlights. A. Among key events after the Magna Carta, which, as Hannan argues, the English-speaking peoples have tended to treat as their Torah, the script that sets them apart, comes the Reformation, transformative with its emphasis on each individual religious believer making his own judgment about the validity of the Bible, and thus needing to be able to read it. This contrasted with Catholicism, with its authoritative popes and priests, and likely substantially boosted literacy rates in the Protestant countries of Western Europe and England. B. For this and other reasons, Protestantism has been the most civilizationally successful major religion apart from Judaism. Protestants having won, for example, from 1900 to 2000, per capita, 3.5 times the number of Nobel Prizes in chemistry, physics, medicine, and economics than Catholics. C. The idea of the separation of church and state is pioneered by the Anglosphere during the Enlightenment. But throughout the West, until this separation was achieved, Protestantism and Catholicism were understood as political ideologies as well as religious. Those adhering to Catholicism were politically antagonistic to Protestant England, given, for example, that in 1570, Pope Pius V had called for a rising against the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, and none of his successors had repealed the papal bull that formally deposed her and absolved her subjects of any allegiance to their monarch. Catholicism and Protestantism were such rivals that even the father of liberalism, John Locke himself, tied himself in knots trying to explain why religious toleration was a good idea for every other sect, but not for the Church of Rome. Incidentally, John Adams thought similarly, wondering, can a free government possibly exist with a Roman Catholic religion? And November 5th is celebrated as one of the great English holidays because on that day, the Catholic conspirator Guy Fawkes was prevented from blowing up Parliament with the intention of installing a Catholic regent. As a result, we English celebrate, some even burning in effigy, both a figure of Guy Fawkes and the Pope on November 5th, these co-conspirators going up in flames together. D. Hannan argues that, even before the Norman invasion in 1066, England was already a nation-state, with a national church, language, and sense of identity. As the historian Susan Reynolds put it, the inhabitants of the Kingdom of England did not habitually call themselves Anglo-Saxons, but English, and they called their kingdom England. Hannan argues that this feeling of national unity resulted in more order, and thus, by implication, a more consistent rule of law than otherwise. E. Another trait of the English political character was the distrust of standing armies, which was a powerful feature of later Anglosphere politics and which can be traced right back to the organization of the Anglo-Saxon county militia, the feared. F. Typically, English was the magnificence of the common law, which is developed by the judgments rendered on individual legal cases by individual judges, and which derived its legal principles from those individual cases, unlike other countries. As Hannan says, common law is thus empirical rather than conceptual, concerns itself with actual judgments that have been handed down in real cases, and then asks whether they need to be modified in the light of different circumstances in a new case. Incidentally, the highest court of all was the Anglo-Saxon Witan, the supreme council that would adjudicate the cases of national importance. It is often forgotten that Parliament began as, and in a few formal senses remains, a supreme court. Relatedly, and not surprisingly, the English from early on were a litigious people, which is actually a good thing since it's better for disputes to be resolved before a judge than by force of arms. G. Both the love of property rights and the English individualism inherent in English society were manifested by the unique English ability for testaments and wills to specify and grant exactly what the person making the will, the testator, wanted. As Hannan says, this individualism had huge consequences, making possible the trusts and foundations that are the basis of civic society and creating an individualist rather than a peasant society in the countryside. And as sociologist Alan McFarlane and others have found, this meant that the farmers of English society, even around the time of the Black Plague in 1348, were noticeably freer than the peasants of other societies. So free, Hannan argues, that the word peasant didn't even exist in English. Just like McFarlane, Hannan suggests, as do other students of early English society, that the individualism of the Germanic tribes that migrated to England may have been influential in creating English individualism. This Teutonic individualism had been noted almost 2 millennia earlier by Roman historian Tacitus. From this respect for individual judgment naturally flowed, as previously mentioned, a pervasive respect for contracts, so pervasive that it encompassed the relations of ruler and ruled as well, with, for example, the early pre-conquest acceptance of the notion that rulers and ruled are bound by a specific agreement, and that if the ruler breaks his part of the bargain, the deal is off. In fact, Hannan argues that the Danish king Canute, invited to become king in 1016, could be called a contract king. H. How does Hannan understand the effect on property rights by the conquest of England by William in 1066? It was a calamitous defeat for England, for the Witan, and for the development of liberty. Indeed, the next 6 centuries can be seen in one sense, and were seen by many of the key protagonists, as an attempt to reverse the disaster of 1066. From that moment on, almost a millennia ago, the French and English have been at odds. Too bad for the French. The English aristocracy of necessity fled, and the country became an occupied, armed camp. I. Contrary to the French experience, with their parliament, the Estates General, being disbanded for over 170 years, from 1614 to 1789, and also contrary to the experience of the Germans, with the Diet of Brandenburg also being disbanded and not having taxing powers, English parliaments, more than any in any European country, played an active and at times decisive role in English political life, the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution being eminent examples. J. Regarding this crucial constitutional period of the 17th century, he mentions the battles between Charles I and the short and long parliaments. 2. Charles's demand to the Speaker of the House for the whereabouts of the missing parliamentarians, and the Speaker's famous reply. 3. The Civil War, and how it was likely less violent because, for the most part, Anglicans were fighting Anglicans, unlike in Germany where Catholics were fighting Protestants. And 4. How, after the Glorious Revolution, it has been tacitly understood that the British people might hire and fire their kings just as they might hire and fire their MPs. K. Moving on, he argues that because England was an island, only needing to have a sufficient navy to protect itself, and thus no real army, this lessened the chance for internal repression of the people, and also meant that the navy couldn't really be used to support the sovereign. The Dutch, too, with their superb navy, might have developed as England did, except that, where Great Britain was an island, the Netherlands occupied a low-lying, almost indefensible plain, and so were preyed on by that king of the frogs, Louis XIV. After the Glorious Revolution, the Atlantic became almost an Anglosphere lake, its gray waves lapping against Nova Scotia, New England, Virginia, Bermuda, Jamaica, the Falkland Islands, St. Helena, Gibraltar, and various African trading posts. L. Hannan describes, during the American Revolution, the great sympathy shown by many Britons for the American cause. Number 1, William Pitt the Elder proposed to repeal every piece of legislation that the American patriots had found objectionable, beginning with the Sugar Act, and to recognize the Continental Congress co-equal with Britons. And number 2, famed conservative Edmund Burke, saying Americans were, for him, more British than those who had remained in the mother island. M. Some of the problems encountered by the British government in prosecuting the American Revolutionary War were that, number 1, the government was prepared to make concessions on the level of the new taxes, but not on the principle of its right to levy them, while the Americans were stubbornly focused exactly on the principle of no taxation without representation. Another second problem was that once the fighting had started, the only way to hold down a population in armed revolt would have been through brutal and repressive measures that were unthinkable. M. The Enlightenment philosophy led to an increased feeling of brotherhood amongst men. And so partly for this reason, Ireland, Scotland, and England were, by the year 1800, joined to form the United Kingdom. When the English and Scottish populations came to see each other as fellow countrymen, then their ancient rivalry mellowed into the good-natured bantering that has lasted to this day. Though the Irish are well known for constituting the Anglosphere's most reluctant member, with fully a century passing from 1911 to 2011 between royal visits, when the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh toured the Republic of Ireland. Turning to other members of the British Commonwealth, he asks, how did a nation founded as a prison camp become one of the healthiest and freest places on earth? The answer? It was an English prison camp. As Hannan says, the fact that Australia was largely made up of lawbreakers was no bar to its political development. On the contrary, criminals of that era were impressively enterprising. Like the American colonists, land was plentiful and the frontier was expanding. British emigrants were, so to speak, allowed to be themselves. The great red landmass of Australia became not a spillover Britain, but an intensified Britain. P. And India? Is that part of the Anglosphere? On the plus side, it's a democracy, speaks English, had 2.5 million of its citizens fighting for us in World War II, is ethnically and religiously pluralistic, and is ruled by the common law. On the minus side, perhaps, is that it's not Protestant and is 1/3 Muslim. Is this an edge case for the Anglosphere? Whatever it is, India has made huge strides over the last half-century, with a large and increasingly westernized and prosperous middle class. In conclusion, I can't speak highly enough of this book. I'd give it an A-, it being filled with hundreds of brilliant political and historical insights, most of which I haven't included. I would only disagree, with his acceptance of Jonathan Haidt's ideas about political instincts, and B, his ignorance of the fact that modern political correctness and wokeness is driven by the very public nature and funding of higher education in the Anglosphere, as well as by its anti-discrimination laws damaging free speech. I would judge this book particularly suited to those interested either in the nature of the civilizational process itself, Hannan being better here than Jared Diamond, and this is a case study of a successful modern example, or for those interested simply in a history of English political development by a modern classical liberal, who would make a fantastic prime minister. Happy for my part that in the modern post-Enlightenment era, we have allowed each nation to do what it does best. The Anglosphere making great nations, the French making great wine and cheese, and the Germans great beer and automobiles. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.